The second season of The Sopranos begins a few months after Junior's arrest. Tony has officially taken over as the head of the DeMeo family while Junior remains incarcerated, and the FBI's board reflects the change on the street. In the meantime, Chris gets a stockbroker's license to run scams on the stock market, and he passes the exam because someone else stands in for him. Melfi is still in hiding and runs her practice from a motel room, while Livia undergoes physical therapy following her stroke. A couple of very important people return to Tony's life in episode 1. Firstly, Sal returns, and I'm calling him Sal because YouTube doesn't like it when I use his nickname, the P word. But anyway, Sal was thought to be a snitch toward the end of season 1, and he disappeared just as Tony was starting to think that Sal was clean. Now, in the present, Sal explains he went to Puerto Rico for a back treatment and due to accusations of being a snitch. He was hurt by those suspicions and he was afraid. He claims that he's back now because of his kids and his desire to earn for the crew again. Tony is understandably suspicious and upset. He even checks Sal for a wire while hugging him. But in the end they patch things up and Sal starts running his own crew again, though you get the sense that Tony is not 100% convinced, warning Sal not to disappear like that ever again. The other person returning to Tony's life is his sister Janice, an utterly unbearable leech who traveled the world and changed her name to Parvati. She has been living in Seattle recently and claiming disability benefits. And she's back in Jersey because she wants to take care of her mother, Livia. Tony and we soon realize that Janice is not being 100% honest as she removes the for sale sign outside Livia's house and she looks into Livia's will. So she's not here just to take care of Livia. By the way, Tony has cut off all contact with his mother. As far as he's concerned, she's dead. So he says to Janice, "Okay, our mother is your problem now." That doesn't stop Tony from stressing over this whole ordeal, and on top of that, he hasn't been seeing a therapist since Dr. Melfi went into hiding. He has been self-medicating, and all of that leads to him suffering a panic attack while driving, which causes a crash. Physically, he's okay, but he has to get in touch with another psychiatrist. However, this new doctor recognizes Tony from the news, and his reputation leads the doc to reject Tony as a patient. Tony then contacts Dr. Melfi to seek her help, but no cigar. She doesn't ever want to see him again, let alone treat him. By the way, it's safe for Dr. Melfi to return to her normal life once again because Tony has taken full control of the family and he weeded out individuals that might cause him and Dr. Melfi any problems. One of those individuals was Philly, who was running Junior's crew as the old man was awaiting his indictment on RICO charges. Philly had been running his mouth about Tony seeing a therapist and his attempt to harm his mother at the retirement home in the season 1 finale, so Gigi is tasked with shutting Philly up permanently. Elsewhere, Chris runs the family's stock scam from an investment firm as its SEC compliance officer. They are making the employees push a worthless stock for a company called Webistics, and one day when Chris decides to leave in the middle of the day to hang out with Adriana, his goons Matt and Sean go a bit too far. They beat the crap out of an employee for giving genuine investment advice on the phone. They even pour hot coffee on the poor guy. And these two dumbasses don't stop there. No, at night they nick a car from their own building's parking garage. So Tony warns Chris in a relatively harsh tone to get a handle on his guys and to make his presence felt. Lastly, there's a big family gathering at Tony's house and his other sister Barbara is present too with her family. Barbara seems to be the most well-adjusted sibling, but that's not a big feat considering the fact that the other two are Tony and Janice. Anyway, at this party you can certainly see that Tony is not fully buying Sal's story, so that's certainly something to keep an eye on. In episode 2 of season 2, Tony goes face to face with his uncle Junior for the first time since his arrest. And even though it's now clear that Junior tried to have Tony killed, the new boss forgives the old man. Largely because Junior has lost his influence thanks to the FBI, and thanks to some hits Tony ordered on Junior's mischief-making men, including Philly, which means Junior can't make a meaningful move on Tony. That is why Tony decides to play this smartly instead of going after Junior and kicking off a war. He makes sure that Junior realizes who's the boss, but he doesn't go any further than that. In exchange for his generosity, Tony takes possession of most of his uncle's businesses except his Shylock operation and some union racket. Also, Junior will keep his title as the official boss, but the de facto boss will of course be Tony, who discusses this subject with Junior's right-hand man and his messenger Bacala. The message finds its way to Junior, but he's no longer behind bars. His lawyer Harold convinces the judge to put Junior on house arrest due to his recurring heart condition. Junior can only leave the house for doctor's appointments, grocery shopping, and some family functions. He uses the doctor's office to conduct his illegal activities as the clinic can't be bugged by the feds, and he argues with Tony about the aforementioned business arrangements in their first meeting there. However, Tony thinks that Junior should be grateful. One other subject they keep discussing is Olivia. Junior is of the opinion that Tony should patch things up with her, repeatedly claiming that she had nothing to do with the hit. It doesn't matter what Junior says because Tony has heard the FBI tapes from the Green Grove retirement home, so he's adamant about not talking to his mother. Talking of Green Grove, Junior mentions the fact that the owner of the place, Freddie, has been running his mouth and alleging that Junior and Olivia were romantically involved, as well as talking about Tony's attempt to kill his own mother with a pillow. Tony agrees that Freddie has to go, and it doesn't take long for him to disappear, if you know what I mean. On the business side, there's a hilarious scheme in this episode in which Tony's crew breaks up a protest outside Masorone Brothers Construction. African Americans are protesting this construction company because they don't hire enough men from minority groups, and this is all organized by Reverend James. So Jack Masorone pays Tony to break this up, and Tony's men do just that. The hilarious part is Reverend James is in on this with Tony. He gets a cut from the money Tony received from Jack. Reverend James and Tony put together the protests in order to squeeze out more money from the Masorones. Checking in on Janice, she eventually wears Tony down, getting him to stop the sale of Livia's house so that she and Livia can live there. Janice's relationship with Livia was rocky at best until she got a tip from Meadow about the kind of music Livia liked. Janice then proceeded to surprise her mother with that music at the hospital, and everything changed. For the first time since Janice returned, Livia thought that her daughter actually cared about her. That is until AJ asked Livia about what DNR means during one of his visits. AJ heard Tony and Janice talking about that term. It means do not resuscitate. And Janice brought this up after Livia almost choked at the hospital, and the nurse asked Janice if they thought about making a DNR, which decides whether or not a patient is kept alive artificially if they ever enter into a coma. So hearing about this from AJ breaks Livia's illusions regarding Janice, and later on she's quite sulky when Janice visits, even though they're gonna move into their house together. Livia even calls Tony's house and tells Carmela that she'll leave everything she has to her granddaughters. Carmela, fully aware of what Livia did to Tony, warns her not to call them ever again. And now the big reveal of the episode. It turns out that Sal was indeed a snitch. He has been working for the feds ever since getting busted up for dealing heroin. The FBI has been good to him, they've been paying for his back treatment, but Sal's handler Skip is getting adamant about wanting to see results. Sal though wants to keep it cool for a while as he just returned home and he doesn't want to raise any alarm bells. Lastly, Junior has a nasty accident in the bathtub and he's pretty sure he's broken something. Bacala calls Tony for help, and despite everything they've been through, Tony still shows up to help his uncle, even carrying his uncle to the car to take him to the hospital. It is exactly these unlikely and unexpected acts of kindness that make Tony such a fascinating character to watch, because even though on the whole his actions make it pretty hard to root for him, even though by all means he's a bad dude, he shows this tender side from time to time that make you think that under different circumstances he might have been a good person. In fact, so far in the series, I think that is what his therapy has revealed. The fact that his environment and upbringing blunted his good qualities, but those qualities still occasionally appear as they did here. The season of comebacks continues with the return of Richie April, who's the brother of the former boss of the DeMeo family, Jackie. He passed away last season due to cancer, and Richie has spent the last 10 years in prison after getting busted for dealing drugs. And the first thing he does when he gets out is to reconnect with his former partner in crime, Beansy. Beansy was dealing alongside Richie back in the day, but he didn't have to go to prison, and later on in his life he stopped dealing to launch a pizza chain with the money he had saved up. Beansy never cut off contact with the mob, he laundered their money, and he's maintained good relationships with everybody including Tony. So because Richie had to spend some time in the can and in the meantime Beansy got rich, Richie feels like Beansy owes him. That's why he pays a visit to one of the pizza parlors, and when Beansy rejects this idea, he gets a good arse kicking. Richie pretends as though he's matured and turned into a calm individual through meditation and yoga, but that's just a facade. It's also clear that Richie doesn't like the way things have shaken up in the mob with Tony ending up at the top. He doesn't appreciate it when Tony urges him to be patient regarding the pace with which he'll get back into the business. He wants everything here and now because he feels like he is owed. Add to that the fact that Richie pledges his loyalty to Junior when these two meet, and Tony seems to have a serious problem on his hands. Richie is further infuriated when Beansy doesn't show up to his welcome back party organized by Tony, so Beansy is in trouble once again. Richie scares him with a gun and eventually drives over him and cripples him. The doctors say Beansy might never walk again, and he asks Tony to retaliate. Unfortunately for the pizza man, he's only a pizza man and not a made man in the mob, and Richie is. So the best Tony can do is just disciplining Richie and getting him in line, which won't do anything to alleviate Beansy's pain. Nonetheless, Richie is an old school guy and it looks like he'll behave and respect Tony's authority as the boss even if he doesn't like it. He kinda has to do that because otherwise he might get clipped. One last note on the former convict, he runs into Janice at a yoga class and these two used to be lovebirds, but they weren't too good for each other. Now that Richie is a changed man though, or at least claims to be one, he wants to get back together. He shows up at the hospital to see Livia. In reality, that is just an excuse to convince Janice to give him another chance. At first she doesn't think this would be a good idea, but deep down she definitely wants to do it. Meanwhile, Meadow throws a party at her grandma's house, which gets out of control and the kids are busted doing drugs. One of the cops on the scene knows Tony, so he gives the mob boss a call and he retrieves his daughter, who claims that she herself hasn't done any drugs and the party got out of hand when one of her friends started inviting the quote-unquote bad boys. This is a massive test of Tony and Carmela's parental authority as they have to strike a balance between teaching Meadow a lesson and alienating her. Before they can decide on what to do, Meadow plays them like a fiddle, pretending to be sorry and suggesting a punishment that would be favorable to her, so she gets away with it with this smirk. Janice gets involved in this twice, firstly when she argues that they shouldn't get angry at or punish Meadow at all, and secondly after she sees the state in which Meadow left Livia's house. She goes berserk in that instance and wants Tony and Carmela to punish Meadow more severely. Both times the parents warn Janice not to get involved and she doesn't listen to them, so she gets told off by Tony and Carmela. In the end, Carmela patches things up with Janice, and Meadow, feeling bad after hearing what her aunt had to say, goes back to Livia's house to clean it. Tony comes across his daughter cleaning the place and he doesn't know what to think. He was very angry, but seeing Meadow take responsibility softens him up a little bit. Maybe she's finally maturing. Last but not least, Dr. Melfi runs into Tony at a restaurant and tries to strike up a conversation, an attempt that Tony sternly rebuffs. The doctor is unexpectedly and embarrassingly flirty. She even says toodaloo when she's leaving, and she's embarrassed by her behavior too. Remember, she didn't ever want to see Tony again, which makes her behavior even more perplexing. She discusses all of this with her own therapist, Dr. Kupferberg, and you can infer that she's regretting her decision not to continue Tony's treatment. She even has a dream in which Tony has a car accident as he runs out of Prozac pills. Tony Soprano's brilliant business mind comes up with yet another lucrative opportunity in episode 4 as he gets in touch with a mafia family from the Camorra region of Italy. That's where Naples is located, and the members of this particular organization are relatives of the Sopranos, albeit very distant relatives. The plan is to smuggle luxury cars from the US into Europe. There are some countries where the demand for them is high, but the supply is low to non-existent. That's why stealing them in the US and selling them in Europe is very profitable. The Sopranos will do the stealing and smuggling, selling these cars to their new friends in Italy, who in turn will sell them for even more profit across Europe. Tony takes Polly and Chris alongside him to Italy, where their contact Furio greets them. It soon becomes clear that Don Vittorio, the official boss of the family, has gone senile, and the acting boss, Mauro Zucca, who's also the son-in-law of Don Vittorio, is in prison. As a result, Tony's first meeting is with a capo named Nino, and these two don't really get along. So it's a good thing that Don Vittorio shows up later on in the evening with his daughter Annalisa. With her father's limited mental capacity and her husband's troubles with the law, Annalisa has become the de facto boss of the family, which Tony finds troubling since he's never met a woman in charge of a mob. The situation in the Italian crime family is more complicated than he thought. That said, the trip does result in a positive deal despite all the possible issues. Tony agrees to give them the cars for a reduced rate in exchange for Furio and any further men he might want to transfer to his crew. Tony is incredibly impressed by the old-school nature of this Camorra family soldiers. They seem to be more loyal and fit the definition of a soldier much better than their counterparts in the US, which is why Tony is so insistent on bringing in the likes of Furio to his own enterprise. One incident tells you all you need to know about Furio and soldiers like him. When they're leaving the restaurant following the initial meeting, a dumb kid starts setting off firecrackers, and at first everybody thinks they're gunshots, so Furio jumps on top of Don Vittorio to protect him, showing that he is ready to die for his general. And afterward they beat the crap out of the kid that set off the firecrackers, as well as his mother who protests. Even Tony and Polly are like, yikes, that's going a bit too far, isn't it? But that is exactly the profile Tony has in mind to revamp the DiMeo family. And I think it's time that I stop calling it the DiMeo family and start calling it the Soprano family, because the Sopranos are firmly in charge. Some final notes on the Italy trip. Tony and Annalisa's relationship almost turns sexual, but Tony acts professionally and refuses to get it on with her. Not because he doesn't want to, as you all know he's a player, but because he wants to separate the personal from the professional. And in the meantime, Polly gets disillusioned by Naples, even though he was extremely excited to go on this trip, while Chris spends all his time doing drugs. They're picked up by Sal at the airport when they get back, and the contrast between the beautiful scenery of southern Italy and the rough-looking landscape of New Jersey is a sight to behold. Talking of Sal, he's been up to no good as he was spotted by another mobster, Jimmy, during a meeting in public with his handler Skip. Sal doesn't think he lied well enough to cover his arse, so later on he pays Jimmy a visit and beats him to death. I suppose that's the only way to make sure that Jimmy would stay quiet. Sal can't afford to raise any suspicions. Sal's wife Angie, in the meantime, is completely sick and tired of Sal. She wishes that he had never come back and is considering divorce. On top of that, she suspects that she might have cancer and she's thinking of offing herself. Angie shares all of this with Rosalie, the late Jackie April's widowed wife, and Carmela, who eventually convinces Angie to stay with Sal. Despite receiving confirmation that she doesn't have cancer, Angie is still depressed as Sal continues to get on her nerves. As for Carmela, she is displeased with Tony's trip to Italy. He's going there without the family, and she's known throughout the season that Tony still has a mistress, so she might have convinced Angie to stay with her family, but Carmela is going through a similar experience with her own husband. I've called this the season of comebacks before, but it's also a season of new arrivals, and one such character who arrives in New Jersey for the first time is Furio, Tony's contact from the Camorra family in Italy. Furio is now a soldier in the Soprano crime family, and he's immediately put into action when a brothel under the mob's protection consistently makes insufficient payments. Furio goes into this brothel, which is run by a couple, and he shows us why his name means fury, as he teaches them a violent lesson they will never ever forget, shooting the husband's kneecap and beating the wife. A delighted Tony waits outside for Furio, and he is surprised to receive a phone call from Dr. Melfi, who would like to continue treating him. The doctor has been talking to her own therapist about this for a while now. She feels guilty about leaving Tony high and dry, which is why she contacts him. At the outset, Tony rejects the doc's offer and instead tries chatting with his wise buddy Hesh about his mental struggles. However, it soon becomes clear to Tony that Hesh isn't that interested in listening to him, and neither is he giving any useful advice, so Tony decides to show up to his appointment with Dr. Melfi. The session has an awkward vibe and they don't make much progress, though at least Dr. Melfi puts Tony on a proper medication schedule. Before we move on, I have to mention something important Hesh revealed to Tony during their chat, and that is the fact that Tony's father Johnny used to have panic attacks too. They were infrequent, but did happen, making Tony believe that his issue might be genetic. Furio's arrival isn't the only shakeup in the criminal enterprise, as Tony promotes Paulie to the rank of capo, while making Silvio his consigliere, i.e. his advisor and his right-hand man. On the other hand, Sal is passed over for a promotion, and he won't even report directly to Tony anymore. At Artie's restaurant, Sal is asked to leave the table as Paulie, Furio, and Johnny Sack discuss business. So a newcomer like Furio is still sitting at the table, but Sal is asked to go away. He's not trusted. By the way, for those who don't remember, Johnny is the underboss of the Lupertazzi family from New York, which is one of the 5 major crime families in the state. Understandably, this treatment substantially bothers Sal, who complains to his FBI handler about it. Sal was in line to get promoted alongside his 2 fellow made men, Paulie and Silvio, but he's being shut out, which further motivates him to continue his snitching activities. On top of that, Sal was visibly flabbergasted at Furio's welcome party organized by Tony, so he's totally embittered. Junior and Bacala showed up to this party too, but they were kicked out before they could enter by Carmela. She obviously knows that it was Junior who put out the hit on her husband. My final note on Furio is about his official working status. Tony convinces Artie to employ Furio at his restaurant as a cheesemaker until he can get citizenship, and Charmaine isn't too happy about this development as Furio isn't that good at making mozzarella. While at least they're not paying his wages, Tony is. Elsewhere, Tony finds out that Janice has taken out a loan on Olivia's house for renovations, and when he goes there to confront his sister, he comes across Richie and learns that he and Janice are back together. Later on, Tony loses it during one of his getaways with his mistress Irina. A Russian man on another boat advises Irina to find herself a Russian man while Tony and Irina are having an argument. And an outburst of rage leads Tony to walk over to the Russian man's boat and grab him by the balls to teach him a lesson. This was supposed to be a relaxing getaway for Tony, but instead he has to run away with Irina before the cops show up. Finally, Adriana gives Chris an acting class ticket. She thinks it might help him with his screenwriting ambitions, which has been a topic of discussion since season 1, but his writer's block has prevented him from making too much progress. And surprisingly, Chris is a very good actor. His emotional acting skills during a reenactment of a scene from Rebel Without a Cause is appreciated by the entire class. Chris, however, quickly leaves in a disgruntled state, as the scene is about a father and a son, a touchy subject for him considering the fact that his father died when he was very young. It is for this reason that he has an outburst of rage in the following class, similar to his Uncle Tony at the marina. Chris beats the crap out of his fellow actor that played the father in the aforementioned scene. He then goes home and gets rid of all of his scripts. It is telling that he acted in a scene from Rebel Without a Cause, as that is exactly what Chris is, a rebel without a cause. In the 6th episode of this season, poker games and friendship dynamics collide, and it all begins when Tony's old pal from school, Davey, strolls back into his life during college night at Meadows School. Davey is the owner of a sporting goods store, and he's seeking entry into the infamous executive game, a high-stakes poker affair with roots dating back to Tony's father and Uncle Junior. Tony's now running this game, and he sees the pitfalls of involving a friend in the perilous world of the mob's poker games. And despite Davey's persistence, Tony declines. Undeterred, Davey finds himself entangled in a lower stakes card game run by Richie, leading to a spiral of debts. The poker drama continues with the official resurrection of the executive game. The game is being held at Shlomo Tiedelman's motel, which is partly owned by the mafia, because when they seek Tony's help in season 1, Tony received part ownership of the business as payment. Sean and Matthew, Chris's goons, are also present to serve the guests, but they're disappointed in the treatment they receive, especially from Silvio. The unexpected entry of Davy, backed by Tony's reluctant approval and lending of 5 large, leads to a night of high-stakes tension. However, as the dawn breaks, Davy finds himself owing a whopping $45,000 to Tony, who is actually blissfully unaware of the ongoing drama, as he was catching some much-needed shut-eye. Then Richie breaks mafia norms and attempts to collect his $7,000 from Davy right there at the executive game poker table, leading to a showdown with Tony. Tony actually sides with Davy, delaying Richie's debt collection until Tony's own due is settled. A humbled Richie has to apologize, but the tension lingers. Davy is desperate to settle his debts, and as a result, the repercussions extend beyond the poker table. He turns to his childhood friend Artie for a loan of $20,000, but Artie doesn't want to get caught up in this. The rejection forces Davy to part with his son's car as partial payment, and Tony, in a misguided attempt to mend things with his daughter, gifts the car to Meadow, unaware that it belongs to Davy's son Eric, who's a friend of Meadow. Meadow's rejection of the tainted gift triggers a family rift, highlighting the collateral damage caused by Tony and Davy's choices. The culmination of the drama unfolds at Meadow's school cabaret night. Eric has an outburst fueled by resentment towards Tony, and he leaves Meadow to perform solo. But weirdly, this actually positively impacts Meadow's college prospects, as she wanted to do a solo performance anyway. Meanwhile, Tony grapples with a growing sense of bitterness, not only towards happy wanderers on the street, but also towards the therapeutic process itself. As usual, Dr. Melfi's attempts to delve into Tony's psyche are met with resistance, and his frustration bubbles to the surface as he contrasts his struggles with the resilience of his hero, Gary Cooper. As if Tony's emotional turmoil wasn't enough, Uncle Junior drops a bombshell about a mentally disabled Uncle Tony had, and this challenges Tony's perception of his family history. Just like when he found out that his father had panic attacks, Tony thinks that his struggles might be genetic. Also, Livia's unwelcome presence at Barbara's father-in-law's funeral and Meadow's school performance adds fuel to the fire of Tony's resentment. On the way back from the funeral, Janice continues to embolden Richie against her brother Tony, which is something she regularly does throughout the season. But despite their differences, Richie is adamant about respecting the chain of command. To the surprise of absolutely nobody, Chris is once again up to no good in the middle of season 2, finding himself in a Jon Favreau production thanks to his cousin Greg's fiancée Amy. She works for Favreau and she encourages Chris to continue writing and bring a copy of his latest mafia story to Favreau himself. And even though Chris got rid of his scripts recently, Adriana has kept copies of them, so the up-and-coming mafia associate is able to meet with the big-shot Hollywood producer, and the two passionately discuss how the mafia works, accompanied by Amy. Her interest is not strictly professional though. She was wildly impressed by Chris's protective demeanor at the bar during their first meeting, when Chris told off a douche in a suit to keep it down, and thus their relationship quickly turns sexual. This happens while Adriana awaits a proposal from Chris. So during dinner one day with the Sopranos, Chris storms off due to this pressure, and he continues to mingle with Amy. He appears ready to move on. Amy, on the other hand, argues that they should come clean to Greg as she feels dirty. However, that's nothing compared to what Favreau has done. He took one of Chris's mafia stories that he told in confidence and used it in his script. Since this is a story from the real world, Chris knows that he could be in trouble, which is why he goes searching for the Hollywood man, though he's unable to find him. Amy insists that Favreau has returned to California, and that whatever happened between them should never be brought up again, prompting Chris to call her a D-girl, which is the title of this episode. Amy responds by saying that she's a vice president, and that's that between them. This distraction serves as a warning for Chris not to lose focus both in his personal and professional lives, with Tony giving the young lad an ultimatum. He either fully buys into this life or he fracks off. This happens at AJ's confirmation party, and in the end Chris decides that this is the best chance he's got of making something of his life. He tried going legit with his script, but that shallow world of Hollywood screwed him over even before he got started. The other main storyline of this episode involves AJ, who has grown disillusioned with life and the concept of religion, turning to nihilistic thoughts and even getting involved in a minor accident with Carmela's car. Tony is bothered both by his son's thought process and actions, claiming to Dr. Melfi that having doubts about religion and faith are not normal. The doc counteracts that claim, explaining that Tony himself would have had them if his parents, especially Olivia, hadn't had such an overwhelmingly repressive presence in his life. Once Tony gives some thought to AJ's concerns, he figures his son might have a point. Avoiding those subjects and figuring out what he actually believes on his own is one of the minor causes behind Tony's mental anguish. Some of his choices were mostly made for him. He didn't have any say in them and he's suffering the consequences. Since Sal is AJ's confirmation sponsor and his godfather, Tony gets AJ to spend some time with Sal and his son Matt, who tries to explain to AJ that there are also non-nihilistic philosophers who can build a framework for their faith. That doesn't seem to help AJ though, and neither does his visit to the hospital to talk to his grandmother, as Livia concludes that life is utterly void of meaning and everybody dies alone. Way to go, Grandma! Carmela and Tony have enough of AJ's cynical demeanor at the confirmation party, and Tony asks Sal to have a chat with the boy. Sal tells AJ about how Tony stayed with Sal's sister at the hospital until her death and cared to her needs. He does this to show AJ that deep down his father is truly a good man, even though that man may have mostly disappeared along the way. AJ finally decides to behave and he heads downstairs for the party, while Sal locks himself in the bathroom to cry like a baby. Why would Sal do that? Well, his handler asked him to wear a wire to the party to get some juicy, incriminating information on Tony, and Sal was almost caught by his own family when he was shaving his chest for the wire, which led to a fight between him and Angie, and this could have gotten really ugly if Matt hadn't intervened, so Sal is not doing too well at all. And talking about his good friend Tony at the party to AJ made him emotional. It became a lot harder for him to go through with his betrayal. All he could do instead was cry. Sal is like a cornered animal, and what cornered him was not Tony. It was the choices Sal himself made, even though he doesn't want to admit this to himself. In the end, the wiretap proves useless, as the wire was damaged when Sal hugged AJ. And that's a wrap for episode 7. Chrissy Boy takes center stage once again in episode 8 as Adriana breaks up with him and he robs safes with his two goons Sean and Matt. I say that, but Sean is mostly busy relieving himself due to adrenaline. Anyway, the Italian Beavis and Butthead aren't too happy with their progress in the organization so far, and they begin making moves to improve their status, starting with a visit and introduction to Richie, and continuing with a weird approach to Tony at the Bada Bing's bathroom. The big boss berates the two knuckleheads for striking up a dangerous conversation there, as the place could be bugged by the feds, frustrating the duo even further. But the final nail in the coffin is Furio's rather ill-mannered collection of Tony's 10% cut. During this exchange, Furio even takes 1K for himself, and the two associates simply have enough. Their concerns might be legitimate, but the steps they take to alleviate those concerns is so moronic that words can't do them justice. Here is their genius idea to create their own path, executing Chris on behalf of Richie, as Richie doesn't like Chris for a variety of reasons, one of which is the fact that Chris mistreats Richie's niece, Adriana. They go after Chris outside a diner, with Sean firing off 3 shots before Chris can hit back. Chris is lucky because Sean forgets to unbuckle his seatbelt, and that's how Chris is able to deliver a lethal blow to Sean, and then he forces Matt to run away like a little girl. Chris is badly injured, but at least he is still alive. Matt decides going to Richie and explaining the situation to him would help him, but Richie is completely bamboozled. He was unaware of all of this, so he chases Matt away with a baseball bat. By this point, Chris had apologized to and proposed to Adriana, and she said yes, so she's devastated to hear the news. Tony is similarly affected, wondering how this could happen to Chris just when he truly committed himself to the mafia, and he even took steps to start a family of his own with Adriana. And they might have their differences, but Tony does love Chris, which is why he's worried sick that Chris might not make it out alive. In between all of this, Meadow's college saga returns. She'd like to study on the other side of the country at Berkeley, while her parents want to keep her close, thinking that Georgetown should do the trick. However, it doesn't look like she'll get into Georgetown, causing Carmela to turn on her Mama Bear mode and chase down her neighbor Jean Cusimano's sister Joan, an alumna of Georgetown, for a letter of recommendation. Carmela's passive-aggressive insistence scares the twins, and Joan does end up writing that letter despite initially refusing to do so. Also during this storyline, Meadow receives a letter from Berkeley urging her to resubmit her application, which is first found by her mother. Carmela tosses the letter in the trash before deciding to retrieve it, and she does her best to clean it, but Meadow does realize something is off when she sees the dirty letter, and despite this, she decides to let it go and stay quiet for now. Lastly, we have the Jacket Gate. This is a storyline that begins with Tony requesting Richie to help Beansy, who Richie crippled at the start of the season. The capo is asked to send his nephew Vito to make Beansy's house wheelchair accessible, but Vito and his crew only finish half the job as they're also renovating Livia's house, where Richie and Janice will live with Livia once she's out of the hospital. Richie promises Tony that he will get Beansy's house done in no time, and he also gifts Tony a leather jacket he got off of Rocco DiMeo, a tough guy from the 70s who was feared by everybody in the family, and Richie got the better of him and got his jacket. Let's just say Tony doesn't share the same admiration for this piece of clothing, probably not due to the jacket itself, but because it's a gift from Richie, and Richie is surprised multiple times throughout the episode because Tony doesn't ever wear it. And Richie begins to question his loyalty to Tony when he brings some food to Carmela as another sign of goodwill, and he sees that their Polish cleaning woman's husband is wearing the jacket. Richie gets so angry he looks like he'll burst a blood vessel, and this certainly will not help the rocky relationship of Tony and Richie. Richie did try to make amends, but they weren't reciprocated. In episode 9, Chris's situation gets worse before it gets better. He is clinically dead for more than a minute before the doctors are able to revive him. Also, his spleen is removed, but it looks like he will survive. The first thing Chris does when he wakes up is to request a chat with Paulie and Tony, urgently telling them what he saw when he died. Chris explains that he went to hell and saw Brendan and Mikey there, and these two had a message for Tony and Paulie, which was 3 o'clock. Paulie in particular is freaked out, and this ominous message haunts him in his sleep, forcing him to seek the help of a psychic who scares him even more by revealing to him the name of the first man he ever killed. He doesn't understand how the psychic could know that, so he hilariously gets angry at his local church as he feels like his donations were supposed to protect him and provide him with immunity. And since that doesn't seem to be happening, he proclaims that his donations will have to stop now. This shows us how Paulie's view of religion is mostly transactional. Tony, on the other hand, discusses the message from the afterworld with Dr. Melfi, stating that he doesn't believe it because soldiers like him and Chris can't go to hell. After all, they're only soldiers in a game whose participants know the rules and the stakes. They agreed to be in the game, so they can't be held accountable. Which in my opinion is a totally demented view of the concept of heaven and hell. But it displays the naivety of Tony in thinking that his core essence of goodness will save him despite his abhorrent actions. Dr. Melfi agrees with me and acts rather unprofessionally, pushing Tony a bit too much on this subject, and she regrets doing so. We learn about this during her own therapy session with Dr. Kupferberg. She is in tears when she admits that she's been drinking heavily and she's afraid of Tony despite taking him back as a client. Her professional and personal interests are colliding. As a doctor, she wants to treat Tony, but on a personal level, she judges him, something a therapist should never do, or at least something they should never make apparent to their client. Elsewhere, Tony is also dealing with Carmela's request for a vasectomy. She is afraid that Tony will one day knock up his mistress, like one of their associates has recently done, and this leads to a minor falling out between the couple. Tony's relationship with AJ isn't any better. He berates his son for constantly eating and finds him a completely unworthy male heir, and says as much to AJ. Later on, he obviously regrets treating AJ that way, and Tony attempts to genuinely bond with his son, but their conversation is interrupted by Sal, who claims to have found Matt. Sal has been under pressure from the FBI as he hasn't been able to get anything on Tony, but taking care of Matt together may allow him to gain Tony's trust once again. They question Matt before ending his misery, and they find out that Richie wasn't behind the attempt on Chris's life. Sal and Tony go on to have dinner together, and it's like the good old days, and on the surface, Sal's plan to regain Tony's trust seems to have worked. Back at home, Tony yields to Carmela, saying he will get a vasectomy. Carmela, though, explains that that's not what she really wants. No, what she'd really like is for Tony to be hers, as he promised. And as the episode comes to an end, they get it on. Episode 10 kicks off with a scare when a civilian points the finger at Tony for Matt's murder. But luckily for the mobster, the witness retracts his statement immediately upon finding out that he identified a man from the mafia. Tony was getting ready to go into hiding at this point, even leaving some money at his lawyer Neil Mink's office to take care of the family while he's gone. But it didn't come to that, at least not yet. I say that because Sal is asked by his handler Skip to get Tony to admit to the murder on tape. Sal obviously can't do that, he was also at the crime scene, but he doesn't share that crucial bit of information with Skip. On the business front, Davy's gambling addiction fully catches up to him, with the Soprano crime family now in control of his sporting goods store to enact a bust-out, buying expensive goods on store's credit to sell it in the streets. The scheme will have to continue until Davy's gambling debt from the executive game is paid off, by which point Davy will have to declare bankruptcy. This whole ordeal takes its toll on his mental health as well as on his marriage, though his wife Christine is not fully aware of the damage just yet. That is why she is still on friendly terms with Carmela, and why she recommends the services of her brother to Carmela, who would like to get some work done on her house. Christine's brother is a sympathetic widower named Vic, and he and Carmela immediately take a liking to each other, going as far as to kiss before realizing they're making a mistake. They agree to have lunch the following day to discuss whatever's going on between them, but Vic doesn't show up. Why? Well, the preceding night, Davy opens up to Vic about the bust-out Tony is running on the store, and Davy admits he lost everything he owned gambling, including his son's college fund. Vic is furious, but he agrees to pay for his nephew's education, and this is enough for Vic to stay away from Tony and Carmela altogether. One last note on this subject, Tony explains to Davy that Davy himself has made his bed and is now having to lie on it. He's the only responsible party. He has no one to blame but himself, as Tony repeatedly warned him that the executive game was out of his reach, and he insisted on taking part nonetheless. Also, Tony candidly tells Davy that when he allowed Davy to enter the game, he knew it could come to this, and that he could use the store as collateral. So he wasn't just being kind to Davy, no, he was making a solid business decision, and now he is milking the store for all it can give. In the meantime, Richie is not happy with his cut from this arrangement, and neither is he pleased with his overall place in the hierarchy of the family and the cut he gets from the sanitation business. This situation is not helped by Janice, who urges Richie to rise to the occasion during a messed up lovemaking session, as she implicitly urges her lover to kill her brother. That is pretty classy, isn't it? This biatch knows no bounds, just like Livia. Soon afterward, Richie brings up his grievances to Junior to make a move, but the old geezer gets angry. Richie defends himself by reminding Junior of what he did just a year ago, putting out a hit on Tony, but it doesn't look like Junior will help Richie. Tony, in the meantime, continues his attempt to patch things up with AJ, though he messes up multiple times throughout this episode. He eventually takes AJ out on his boat and helps him capsize some poor blokes, and they have fun. Tony also shares a sweet moment with Meadow one night, admitting to her that he's a hypocrite, but he still loves her. Meadow returns the favor, adding that everybody is a hypocrite sometimes. This episode does a lot to highlight the fact that Tony truly cares about the well-being of his children, even though he doesn't do everything he can all the time to help their well-being. During one of his sessions with Dr. Melfi, he claims that he doesn't mind going to prison as long as his kids have grown up, because he doesn't want to be an absentee father. Last but not least, he takes care of his friend Beansy, gifting him $50,000 despite the poor guy's reluctance to accept. As the season 2 finale approaches, Tony is troubled by Richie's ongoing disobedience, as well as the FBI's intensified effort to put him behind bars. First off, Tony finds out that Junior and Richie have been selling drugs using one of their legitimate businesses, Baron Sanitation, and he warns the zealous Richie to halt those activities as they might attract the Fed's attention. Richie and Junior discuss this matter and decide to keep going. Junior has profited a lot from this arrangement, and that's how he's been able to pay his legal and medical bills. At the same time, Tony is advised by his lawyer to take a step back from the daily activities of the mob and stop hanging out at mob-associated places like the Bada Bing all day, and instead go to work at Baron Sanitation to paint a better picture for the FBI, showing them doing his actual work as a waste management consultant. As a consequence of the boredom that quote-unquote job brings and Richie's continued insubordination, Tony suffers another panic attack at a banquet. He's dealing with a rash on his arm, and Dr. Melfi is of the opinion that it's because of his new lifestyle. She likens Tony to a shark, suggesting that he's crashing because he's not constantly on the move, engaged in illicit activities. Boredom is worsening his condition. It's giving him time to reflect on his behavior, and he's not liking what he's seeing. Thereafter, Tony returns to his usual lifestyle, hanging out with the guys at the Satriales while Agent Harris introduces his new partner to Tony, and they all have a weirdly pleasant chat, as if one party is not trying to nail the other one. I should mention that Tony's time at Baron Sanitation wasn't completely devoid of fun. He continued to seek thrills wherever he could find them, which included putting together a betting pool for the workers there and having some fun with a receptionist named Connie. Dr. Melfi's condition is almost as bad, if not worse than Tony's. She starts drinking in between sessions on days she treats Tony, because as we've already discussed in previous episodes, she can't deal with Tony on a personal level. And in this episode, because of her overall mood and her drinking problem, she embarrasses herself at a restaurant with her son Jason. Dr. Kufferberg is worried about his colleague, advising her to stop seeing Tony, and he prescribes her new medication. Lastly, we have some romantic developments. Richie and Janice are now engaged, and Junior begins a relationship with a woman named Catherine, the widow of a dirty cop Junior used to know. These two meet at the hospital. Junior is there about his breathing problem, and he begins using a CPAP machine for sleep apnea. Oh, and I almost forgot to include this, but Junior gets his hand stuck on the garbage disposal unit for more than 6 hours before Janice and Richie save him. So the former boss is dealing with a lot. Richie and Janice, the lovebirds of Season 2, rush into marriage plans in the penultimate episode of the season. They choose a new house and throw an engagement party at Tony's place, where Carmela, feeling emotional, breaks down seeing her sister-in-law's seemingly ideal relationship compared to her own struggles with Tony and his mistress Irina. Tony, influenced by his talk with Janice, ends things with Irina, but the Russian Guma doesn't take it well. She tries to harm herself and ends up in the hospital. Tony visits her to clear things up, but she remains persistent about being with him. To convince her and to help her move on, Tony sends her $75,000 through Silvio, and Silvia, alongside Irina's cousin, managed to convince her. Meanwhile, when Tony confesses his ongoing infidelity and Irina's suicide attempt to Carmela, she understandably reacts with resentment. Seeing Richie and Janice's bond at the engagement party adds to her turmoil, prompting her to find closure with Vic. She thanks him for not showing up to their lunch date, realizing it might have led to regretful actions. She hints at a potential serious relationship in the future, when she might become emotionally and maybe legally free. Taking a break from romance, Richie faces frustration as Tony shuts down the coke business on the garbage route and bans Richie from being around his kids after his altercation with Beansy. This prompts Richie to plot a takeover and he seeks Junior's help. However, he hits a roadblock with Albert's refusal. Albert is the acting capo of the Baresi crew, with Larry Boy behind bars. Junior senses that Richie is just too weak. He can't even get Albert's support. So the old geezer informs Tony about the coup. Tony is unsurprised by Richie's treachery, but he's intrigued by Junior's alliance and loyalty. But he sees it as a survival move on Junior's part. He doesn't read too much into it. The boss orders Silvio to eliminate Richie, but it actually doesn't come to that. A heated argument erupts between Richie and Janice at Livia's house, and this argument is about Richie's son's career as a dancer, which might lead to him being viewed as gay. When Janice suggests that might not be a bad thing, Richie violently strikes Janice. She goes inside and she returns with a gun, shooting Richie twice and killing him. This unexpected turn serves Tony's interests. Richie is gone and Janice is forced to leave town. 2 goals on Tony's agenda. He has killed 2 birds with actually 0 stones because he hasn't had to do anything. Chris and Furio dispose of Richie's body and Tony sends Janice back to Seattle. Livia, unaware of these events due to a sleeping pill, awakens to the news of Richie's departure. She launches into criticism toward Janice and claims she foresaw Richie leaving her. Tony berates his mother in return, and he stumbles his way out of the house, to which Livia reacts in amusement. Tony is hit with another development when he gets back home, where Carmela tells him that she's visiting Rome with Rosalia Brill, and the matter is not up for discussion. Also, Tony implies to her that Richie is dead by saying he's never coming back and that Janice has moved back to Seattle. So Carmela's idealistic view of these 2 lovebirds, which made her cry, turns out to be totally false. In the meantime, Sal embarks on a hilarious journey after aiding the FBI with intel on Tony's illicit airline ticket operations and the bust-out scheme on Davy's store. Sal achieves this by wearing a wire at Richie's engagement party, and then he begins fantasizing about becoming an FBI agent after his cooperation and time served. And despite Skip's attempt to ground Sal, he adopts an agent persona, surveilling Chris's heist of a Pokemon card shipment. And as expected, it ends disastrously. Sal causes a car accident, injuring his knee and colliding with a cyclist. As the season 2 finale gets going, Tony and Barbara try to find a permanent solution to the Livia problem. Barbara's husband refuses to take Livia in, so that's not an option. She can't live with Carmela and Tony, and she can't go back to the retirement home either, so they are at an impasse. Tony has enough of his mother's mental games and crocodile tears during this meeting, and fetches 2 airline tickets from his car, giving them to Livia. She will go to Arizona with her sister to live with their other sister. Problem solved. By the way, those tickets were bought illegally using the bust out on Davy's store. And then we are shown another illegal scheme Tony is running, this one with the help of Indian associates to sell calling cards. Tony dines at an Indian restaurant first and then at Artie's place with Sal and Furio. Sal's explanation of the calling card scam to Furio sets off alarm bells in Tony's head because it doesn't appear as though Sal is speaking naturally. He's talking as if somebody is listening. That's because they are. But Tony doesn't make too much of it and goes home to patch things up with Carmela. They get it on after Tony gifts her a very nice fur coat, but it starts to go downhill from there. I say that because Tony begins having fever dreams, eventually realizing that he has food poisoning. At first he thinks he's got cancer because that's what he finds out in one of his dreams, but it turns out to be false. In these dream sequences, he burns himself, he sees himself shooting Polly while playing cards, he has intimate moments with Dr. Melfi, and most importantly, he comes across Sal on a fishmonger stall. Yes, you heard me right. Sal is literally on a stall as a fish, a reference to the idiom popularized by The Godfather, sleeping with the fishes. Here, Sal admits to Tony that he's working for the feds, and this dream allows Tony to accept the fact that his friend has turned. Tony has had his suspicions throughout the season, but his subconscious is warning him to finally do something about it. As soon as he's able to, he goes to Sal's house with Silvio, lying to Sal about the reason for his visit, saying that he wants Sal to take a look at a boat he's thinking of buying. Tony pretends to vomit to get into Sal's bathroom. Silvio and Sal go downstairs, which is when Tony looks around the room and finds the tape recordings under Sal's cigar box. That is the final nail in Sal's coffin. Polly joins them at the marina and they go out to the sea. Sal doesn't admit to snitching at first, but he ultimately has to cop to it, claiming that for the most part he fed the government lies and disinformation, though he admits that the feds know about the calling card scam. Following a bit of back and forth, Sal's sentencing commences. Tony is judge, jury, and executioner, and Sal may be their good friends, but snitches always get stitches. All three of Tony, Silvio, and Polly empty their mags on Sal before dumping his body in the ocean. Back at home, more trouble awaits Tony as Olivia is stuck at the airport with her stolen tickets getting flagged. FBI shows up with a warrant to Tony's house and informs Tony that they've already found other tickets in his car, so he is in more trouble than he realized. This leads to his arrest just as Meadow shows up with her friends, terribly embarrassed. Tony's lawyer Neil gets him out on bail just in time for Meadow's graduation, but before that Tony pays a visit to Dr. Melfi's office and she can see that something is wrong with Tony. He is lashing out at Indians for the food poisoning, bringing up his intimate dreams featuring the good doctor to embarrass her, and she can see that Tony is using these to hide what is really going on. He is in anguish for two reasons. Firstly, because it is now a confirmed fact that his friend betrayed him. And secondly, due to the fact that he had to take care of this problem. He had to kill his friend. He pretends to be one of the happy wanderers he hates, but there's a storm brewing inside of him. Lastly, there is Meadow's graduation party. Tony finds out that Davey is going away to Nevada with his marriage in tatters, and his son is going to a subpar college due to debt. Meadow, on the other hand, is going to Columbia. There's another graduation of sorts in this episode, and that is the promotion of Chris to a made man. He has earned his buttons, and there's now space in the organization with Richie and Sal gone, so Chris's dream can come true. With his daughter's graduation and his nephew's promotion, surrounded by friends and family, this is supposed to be a joyful moment for Tony. However, something continues to bother him. How he's got to this point, what he's had to do to live this life. His criminal activities are shown alongside moments from his personal life, and we see the cost of this quote-unquote great life he's living. He lights a cigar at the corner of the room as a shot of the ocean appears with waves crashing on the shore, signaling that the sea, the ocean, which is Sal's resting place, is not calm. And that is exactly how Tony feels, uneasy. Alright everybody, that's all of Season 2 wrapped up in under an hour. Be sure to leave a like on this video if it was useful, and subscribe for more TV show breakdowns. Take care and see you in the next video.